The Money Show.
Business Books.
It took Michael Cardo 6 years to write his biography of Harry Oppenheimer. Michael's a DAMP. In his spare time, he gained special access to the Oppenheimer family archives to bring life and colour to the story of one of South Africa's most extraordinary business builders. I think it's a balanced book. It's got the critical part of the legacy of migrant labour. It talks to to Harry Oppenheimer's own regret at not pushing back stronger against government of the day. And while Nelson Mandela, at his Anglo farewell, also made reference to the company's history and possible complicity in a system that made them profitable, but the system, unfortunately, was overbearing on the people who worked within the mining sector. Nelson Mandela also paid tribute to Harry Oppenheimer as an extraordinary South African who significantly shaped the modern economy. This weekend, I was fortunate enough to be at the Franschhoek Literary Festival. I chaired a number of panels, including this one in a packed New School Hall on Saturday afternoon with Michael Cardo, author of Diamonds, Gold and Dynasty.
It wasn't easy because, as you say, I'm a member of Parliament, and Parliament isn't the most conducive environment in which to research and write a book. You know, it's clamorous and cacophonous and it's noisy and it's hard to concentrate. And on top of that, most of my research material was in Johannesburg, so I would have to make trips up to the Brenthurst Library, which is the most fabulous repository of Afrikaner, where all of Harry Oppenheimer's papers are kept, or HFO, as I will refer to him in the course of this discussion. HFO was the nickname given to Harry Oppenheimer after his initials, and that was how he was known in the corporate empire of Anglo American and De Beers. So all of HFO's papers are kept at the Brenthurst Library, and indeed all of the family papers are there. His father, Sir Ernest, his mother's papers, his wife, Bridget Oppenheimer's papers, and she had some of the most wonderful material. Bridget Oppenheimer kept a scrapbook for every year of her married life, and they grew progressively fatter with each passing year. And in these scrapbooks, she would literally pluck everything from her old computer forms, her racing, she was a great racehorse owner, and she would put her racing cards in there, she would put dinner invitations in there, she would put photographs in there, and I came across some of the most marvelous stuff, including a dinner invitation sent to the Oppenheimers from John F. Kennedy and his wife Jackie Kennedy when they were in the White House in 1962. So the Oppenheimers...
Did they go?
They did indeed.
Oh, they did.
They went to dine with the Kennedys in 1962.
Just in time, really?
Yes, literally
as it turns
just in time. And so there's all sorts of wonderful material that I had to wade through.
Is this public material, or is this material that you had to ask for permission to access?
No, the material is embargoed, it's restricted access, and one of the great joys of working on this book is that nobody had ever had access to this material before, and for a historian, that's always a major boon, because you want to be the first person discovering new material. And as I reflect in the introduction to this book, when I first went up to the Brenthurst Library in 2017, I felt a bit like one of those diamond diggers who arrived in Kimberly in the 1870s or on the Waterfront goldfields a decade later. As I say, armed with my metaphorical pick and shovel, I set upon the archive as if it was the researcher's El Dorado. And it was terribly exciting for me because all this stuff was new. It was terribly exciting and also incredibly daunting because there was a vast amount of it. And one of the difficulties, just circling back to your earlier question, is that I was doing this part-time, and it was very difficult for me to gather momentum because, I'd go to the archive, not go back for a couple of months, come back, read stuff, and then suddenly after I was reading through these papers, I thought, well, actually, you've read this before. So I think in order to really get to grips with your subject, you need to be immersed in their life, and undiluted time helps in that regard. Ernest Oppenheimer arrived in Kimberley 6 months after the death of Cecil John Rhodes, a man he held in high regard. Never met him, but there was a mystique, an allure around Rhodes, and Ernest Oppenheimer was fascinated by him. And he arrived in Kimberley, did Ernest Oppenheimer, late in 1902. So the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, was over, and he proceeded to set himself up in Kimberley, and very unusually, unlike many of his brothers, he stayed there, because from a relatively young age, Ernest Oppenheimer came to conceive of himself as a man of Africa, and he wanted South Africa to be his adopted homeland.
But at some point, does he pull a fast one, or what is it with the partners in London? Because he goes independent. Does he go rogue?
He doesn't go rogue, but there is a sort of a parting of the ways. This is fast forwarding somewhat to 1917, when he actually...
It's going to be a very long afternoon if we go year by year.
well, that's why I'm fast forwarding so rapidly to 1917, when he founds the Anglo American Corporation. And this obviously gives him an entree into gold, but he retains an interest in diamonds. And in fact, both Ernest Oppenheimer and his son Harry, I think it's fair to say of them, that diamonds were their first love. Diamonds exercised some kind of magnetism for them. There was the aesthetic allure of diamonds. They found them beautiful objects. And so Ernest never lost his interest in diamonds, even after the formation of the Anglo American Corporation, to the extent that in the 1920s he started expanding his sphere of operations into Southwest Africa. He basically comes to dominate the diamond fields there, and he also keeps his eye on De Beers, because he thinks that De Beers isn't being well managed. The management is sort of old-fashioned, conservative, sclerotic, and he makes sure that eventually he comes to have dominion over De Beers, which happens essentially in 1929. So I'm fast-forwarding rapidly.
No, absolutely, and the detail, for those of you who want the detail, is well chronicled in the book. At what point does Ernest become a global player? Because Anglo American is an important part of the story, because the Oppenheimers start moving very early in very highfalutin circles. And there's the connection to the United States and J.P. Morgan happens fairly early on.
Yes, so he gets funding from J.P. Morgan right at the outset, and he very rapidly inserts himself in the British political establishment, becomes very well acquainted and friendly with senior, especially conservative Tory British politicians, and so he's a great mover and shaker. He's knighted certainly in the 1920s, and the move into America, bear in mind that he'd had this backing from J.P. Morgan, as far as diamonds concerned, happens also in the 1930s. So I think Sir Ernest's two great achievements, which put him on the world map and make him a global player, is one, the way in which he transforms the institutional machinery of the diamond industry in the 1920s and 1930s, and above all, the way he props up the diamond industry, which falls on incredibly hard times in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when diamond production in South Africa essentially ceases. And Ernest Oppenheimer is amassing this huge stockpile of diamonds for De Beers. So he makes a name for himself globally through diamonds in the 1930s, keeping the industry going through the Great Depression. But then Anglo's real breakthrough occurs towards the end of the following decade, late 40s, early 50s, when the Orange Free State goldfields are opened up. This really is a turning point.
We'll get to we'll get to those goldfields in just a moment. They're sitting on this stockpile of diamonds. They control through the 20th century, up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, 80% of the global diamond trade. They've got this wonderful monopoly on global diamonds. They've got huge supply, but they have no customers. Now, Harry comes to the fore, and Harry, and I'll get to why Harry's first, to my mind, act of brilliance comes through, but Harry and his dad are like besties.
Yeah.
They are, if you ever want a really great story of a father-son partnership where there is enormous respect both ways, they have different skill sets, but they have a huge amount of mutual admiration. And Harry is born into this environment. Yeah. And Harry is, from the beginning, very clearly the prodigy.
Yeah, as I say in the book, he was possessed of a strong sense of manifest destiny from a very early age. It never occurred to him to do anything other than go into the business. I mean, he had essentially been raised and coached to do that. It was his long apprenticeship. But Ernest Oppenheimer and his eldest son, because bear in mind, Harry had a brother, Frank, who died tragically in 1935. Frank was 2 years younger than Harry. But Ernest and Harry had what I describe in the book as an almost telepathic connection. There was this kind of intuitive gut understanding of one another. They were both deeply interested in both business and politics, yet they had completely different personalities. So Nicky Oppenheimer actually described his grandfather, Sir Ernest, to me as a bit of a swashbuckler. He was a bit of a pirate. He was a real, true entrepreneur. He was a great risk taker. Harry was much more conservative in outlook than his father. He was much more restrained.
When you say conservative in outlook, political conservatism or financial conservatism?
I think more conservative in terms of taking risks as a businessman. We can get onto the politics too, because the labeling and the identification of his brand of politics is interesting. And what I say in the book is that he was a liberal of a conservative bent. But I suppose the essential point I'm driving at is that, Ernest was warm and avuncular. Harry was a little more guarded, more introspective, and he was much more cerebral, much more analytical, much more measured. His thinking was much more structured, whereas Ernest Oppenheimer operated on impulse. And one of the great things about this relationship of opposites was the synergy that was created by these two different personality styles. Ernest Oppenheimer fizzed with ideas, but it was Harry who put them down on paper, marshaled them methodically, and they had this wonderful interplay and dynamic.
It's interesting that they maintained that relationship, because from little, Harry was off to Charterhouse,
yes,
which is in Surrey, and then went to Oxford. And so there were times where they were apart quite a lot. I'm sure part of Ernest's strategy of being immersed in British politics was so that he could see Harry from time to time. But there weren't exactly overnight flights in those days. It was a tough time to be sort of separated and apart and all of that sort of stuff.
Indeed, and they were separated for long periods of time. So Ernest Oppenheimer, as I said earlier, conceived of himself as a man of Africa with an interest in both business and politics, and he became the mayor of Kimberly. The family was driven out of the town in 1915 after the sinking of the Lusitania because of their German surname. This wasn't looked very kindly upon by the townsfolk. So the mayor of Kimberly, Ernest Oppenheimer, was driven out of Kimberly and felt bitter and sore and resentful.
And never really went back, did he?
And vowed never to go back, certainly vowed never to live there again. He had to go back there for De Beers business, of course. But, this was really something scarring. He was taken in by the nuns at the convent. He'd gotten his wife, May Pollock, that's Harry's mother, and Harry and his brother out just in time. But he himself came under massive fire, not literal fire, but he was driving his car and he was stoned and he was badly injured, and the nuns took him in. And he never forgot this act of kindness, which is why the Oppenheimer family for a very long time, and still possibly, I think, has funded that convent. So the family was driven out of Kimberly. They seek refuge with Harry's mother's parents, a very well-to-do Jewish family in the United Kingdom. And Ernest Oppenheimer is sailing back and forth between the UK and South Africa throughout the First World War. So Harry has separated him from his father there, and again when he's sort of sent off to Charterhouse. And he only sees his father for about 6 weeks a year. He comes home for the long vacations, and his abiding memory of that is walking around the grounds of Brenthurst, the Oppenheimers' residential estate in Johannesburg, with his father, deep in conversation. And he remembered later in life his father imparting lessons to him, which he subsequently came to realize were from Voltaire's Zadig and Candide. But the interesting thing about Harry is he writes continuously to his father when he's at Charterhouse, and he says, "Dear Daddy," he was always addressed his letters to his father as "Dear Daddy, please do send me the latest Hansards of your speeches." Ernest Oppenheimer was a member of Parliament for the South African Party. He was a great Smuts man. Jan Smuts was a friend of Ernest Oppenheimer's, and Ernest was a loyalist of Smuts. He represented the South African Party in Parliament from 1924 to 1937, and Harry asked for all the Hansards to be sent to him, and the business interest was also mutual. I came across HFO's school-leaving form. I went to Oxford to HFO's old college, Christchurch, and there was a school-leaving form from Charterhouse dated 1922, and one of the questions was, "What is your interest in life?" And there was a one-word answer: business. Yeah.
What a lovely way to conclude that discussion. Michael Cardo at the Franschhoek Literary Festival on Saturday, talking to me about the biography that he's written on Harry Oppenheimer, Diamonds, Gold and Dynasty.